Hello, my name is Deborah Lee. I'm not a regular contributor to YouTube. In fact, this is the first video I have ever made. I want to tell the story of my daughter's death. I want to reach the people who might be under the same consultant as Helen and who could possibly be in the same situation as Helen. I've recently found out that the mainstream media have been running Helen's story. So I've been thinking of doing this video for quite a while, but I've now decided that after looking at the mainstream media, that now's the time to do the video. The mainstream media obviously cannot mention any names, but I can, and that's what I'm about to do. This video is a name and shame video. So my daughter Helen was under the care of a neurologist at Sheffield Hallamshire Hospital. He's an honorary neurologist and his name is Professor Marcus Ruber at Sheffield Teaching Hospitals NHS Trust. She was diagnosed by him with epilepsy in 2014 based on two tests that she had, which was an EEG and a sleep-deprived EEG, both of which showed changes, and then on the history of the type of seizures that she'd been having, which included tongue biting, having the seizures in her sleep, loss of memory afterwards. In other words, they were all typical of epilepsy and epileptic seizures. She was put on medication for epilepsy, and this medication seemed to be making a difference because Helen went for 8 months without any seizures at all. The hospital then wanted to change her medication and put her on a different medication, which we agreed to. But after taking it for a month, Helen had got all the side effects, really bad side effects. So we told the hospital and they changed her back onto her original medication. So what happened is, I had been asked by Professor Ruber to see if I could video one of Helen's seizures so that he could look at it. In September 2015, Helen was at my house and had 3 seizures in succession. I managed to capture the first part of a seizure, but the video was only 50 seconds long because the seizures were successive and we were so concerned about Helen's state that we had to call an ambulance. So I submitted this video to Professor Ruber for him to have a look at, and after discussing it with his registrar, who by the way is a doctor who is training in the neurology specialist, he came to the conclusion, that's Professor Ruber, came to the conclusion that on the basis of this video, that Helen had non-epileptic attack disorder, not epilepsy. Non-epileptic attack disorder is what's called a psychogenic seizure disorder. So if I put that into everyday terms, what it means is it's all in your head. So this is what Helen was told that she had. We weren't told anything about NEAD. Professor Ruber gave me the NEAD website address and said go and read up on it, which I did. The only comforting thing in reading up about it was that you can't die from an NEAD seizure. Because it's all in your head, your body's defence mechanism will stop you from dying from an NEAD seizure, as opposed to epilepsy, because that is a misfire in your brain. Your body's defence mechanism doesn't work. So that was sort of the only saving grace of having NEAD. Helen did the psychotherapy, she hated it, it didn't seem to make any difference. But the worst thing was that when she was diagnosed with NEAD, the support of the epilepsy nurses stopped. So Helen continued to have seizures, but there was nobody to report them to. And we had to deal with them on our own. That was it. NEAD, you just get on with it, which is what we did. But Helen's seizures were getting worse, and they were getting more frequent. And it got to the stage where we were convinced that it was epilepsy and not NEAD. I tried to get her appointment with Professor Ruber brought forward, but I couldn't get it brought forward. She saw him in January of 2018. I was with her, and he was very, very adamant that Helen did not have epilepsy. He wasn't interested in the fact that her seizures were increasing and getting worse. He was only interested in the fact that she was still having migraines, and he said she had NEAD. Now, just to clarify that a little bit, as well as being a neurologist, Professor Ruber is a specialist in NEAD. He's been published multiple times, and in one of his published articles, he cited the fact that epilepsy costs the NHS a lot of money. I don't know whether that has any bearing on anything, but he made the decision based on the video. Nobody checked his decision. I didn't ask for a second opinion, which I will forever regret till the end of my life that I didn't ask for a second opinion. So he changed her diagnosis based on a 50-second video. Now, in the news reports, the NHS Trust are saying that Helen had several investigations while she was under the hospital, and everything was discussed. Helen had 2 investigations right at the start of being diagnosed with epilepsy. She had an EEG and she had a sleep-deprived EEG, both of which showed that there were some variants in her brain waves that led her to have a propensity to suffer epileptic seizures. So that was it. We were settled on the fact that she'd got epilepsy. And when he changed the diagnosis, everything else changed. No support from the epilepsy nurses, no support from anybody. And then on the 14th of May, I get a phone call from her partner saying that they were on FaceTime and she'd just disappeared off the screen. So I went up to her house, which isn't very far away from where I live. I'd rung her best friend who lived 4 doors away from her. And when I got there, I could just hear her best friend screaming at me to get in there. I walked into Helen's room and she was on the floor, and I knew straight away that she was dead. It's just something that I knew. I did CPR, her best friend did CPR. I knew that it wasn't going to work. The paramedics came. She had 3 shots of adrenaline. That didn't start a heart. They'd got the defib, they'd got everything going. They took her to hospital because of her age, I think. And when they got to hospital, they managed to restart her heart. But her brain had been without oxygen for an hour. And even though she was on the life support machine, I knew that she was never going to recover. And I knew that she wouldn't want to be left in that state. So we made the decision to turn off the life support. Now, about a month and a half after Helen died, her consultant, Professor Marcus Ruber, sent me a letter to say how sorry he was to hear about Helen's death, and that it's very difficult to diagnose epilepsy and it's very difficult to diagnose NEAD. and in retrospect she must have had both epilepsy and NEAD, something that we were never told. So when I read that letter, I just couldn't believe it. Helen's death could have been avoided, and this is when I went to a solicitor with a medical negligence case. Now, in September last year, the medical negligence case settled out of court. The reason for that is that we were on a no-win, no-fee basis. It was 8 weeks before the trial date, and NHS Resolution contacted my solicitor and said they wanted to settle out of court. Now, what this does for NHS is if they settle out of court, it doesn't become public knowledge, and it keeps it out of the papers. So there isn't the publicity that goes with a court case. They settled out of court. They didn't admit liability, but the sheer fact that they settled out of court tells me that they didn't think that they had a cat in hell's chance of winning. Now, for the court case, each side had to have an expert witness, and their own expert witness admitted that the care fell below the standard of what would have been expected. So they settled out of court. The only thing you can do with a medical negligence case is you get money, which is not what we wanted. Had I have been able to afford to pay a solicitor, I would have insisted on taking this to court, but I couldn't. And when you are doing a no-win, no-fee, the insurance company that backs this up will insist that you settle out of court. So that's why we had to settle out of court. In one way, it was a victory for me because settling out of court, whether they admit liability or not, means that they know that they can't defend what they did. So that is the way I see it. The reason for putting Helen's story out there is because there are probably a lot of other people out there who have been told they've got epilepsy, and then they've been told that they haven't got epilepsy, they've got NEAD. Professor Ruber is still working at Sheffield Hallamshire Hospital as a consultant neurologist, still seeing patients. He's still highly published. He's on various committees. He helped to formulate the gold standards for diagnosing epilepsy, the gold standards that unfortunately he never applied to Helen. So I'm putting this video out there because I am naming and shaming him. And if anybody is under Professor Ruber, go and get a second opinion is the best thing I can advise.